Hey, what's going on, YouTubers? This is Manga here, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. So we are on episodes. I would just say for the rest of the episodes for the season for Baki, we're just gonna do a rundown on these episodes. If you want to do a recap on episode 1 and 2, you could check out my older videos. But for the most part, we embark on the 5 prisoners who make their epic entrance in their different ways within Grappler Baki, or Baki 2018 as it is presented on Netflix. Now, overall, all of the different, I would say for the most of season 1, we're really introduced and go through the story between Spec and also Dorian. For the most part, Dorian is pretty much, I would say he takes up most of all of season 1. Spec takes up a couple of episodes in the sense of him going against Hanayama, and it is if you know anything about Baki, it is a brutal anime in the sense that the fights are just all out, right? Even when the prisoners are speaking to I would say the stars or the main fighters for Baki, such as Retsukayo, basically Orochi, and all of them, they're basically saying that we could start to fight anytime, any place, anywhere, and that's exactly what they do. And it is very brutal. So even the fight between Spec and Hanayama, that is like a true brawl in the sense of just picking up stuff, bashing each other, knocking each other out, smashing each other's head into the ground, and just going just like full brutal force, which then are really realistically they're not like opposites, Hanayama and also Spec, but at the same time they're very similar. But overall, Spec does receive defeat by the hands of Hanayama in terms of his just like brute power and godlike abilities, and overall it's just a good fight. So it kind of ends off as expected, with Hanayama getting some brutal I would say injuries towards his face, and just overall, like, he was still triumphant, but at the same time he won. Now, the reason why Spec is a little bit interesting is because of his age. I believe he's in the hundreds of age. When I say 100, so he's like 100 plus, and he's been living for a long time, and it isn't until he receives defeat that his age actually shows. And before that, he looks like someone who could be in the age bracket of like 50s to like 60s in terms of like facial aesthetics, but his body is like, just like really tall, really muscular. But when he's defeated and they show him in the hospital, they show a withered old man, a really tall withered old man, and it just goes to show you that it's a little bit confusing how they explain this, but they're showing like once, if they had like a precedent case for this, that there's a man who had aspirations to achieve something, and because he constantly wanted to achieve it or something of the nature, that it kind of brought him youth, right? And it wasn't until he lost all of what he was or all of what he had until the age really started to show, right? So this is the case for Spec himself. That part was a little bit confusing for me overall. So I would say if they could, that's my one critique in the first couple of episodes, is that in the first season with the whole thing with Spec, they could have done a lot better in the explanation of his story. But overall, we then transitioned to Dorian, who is kind of like I would say the rest of the season, in the sense of multiple people trying to beat him, and we come to the understanding of his full story. And his full story is he is a Westerner, but he is the Westerner. If you watch Grappler Baki, the first tournament, the first season, or the prior series to Baki 2018, I know it gets a little bit confusing sometimes. Then you'll understand that when they first introduced Retsukayo, they kind of showed a silhouette of a Westerner, basically breaking through the walls as a test. And now we come to find out that the Westerner is actually Dorian, and Dorian is actually is a Kaio in the sense that he's trained in Chinese Kempo or Chinese Kung Fu, which is really cool to see, that he's a tall, muscular Westerner who's traveled the world basically, and he's learned multiple styles, and he faces off against a lot of people within, I would say, the rest of the season. He faces against um, Kato or Kato, however you want to pronounce it. He faces off against, I would say, the most popular fight, I would say, would be him against Dopo, Orochi Dopo. And Orochi Dopo is the one that I would realistically say is the one who grants him defeat, even though that's not the case. It's actually Kato now, or Kato. Kato faces off against Dorian a little bit later in the couple of episodes, and when he faces off against him, um, he really destroys Kato in the sense that, you know, he breaks multiple bones. Cuts and bruises are just like ridiculous. So he faces off against him, and then that fight kind of comes to a conclusion where Kato is just like really just like torn up and like messed up. But then our first introduction to, and I'm kind of going backwards a little bit now, Dopo fights off against Dorian, and when Dopo fights off against Dorian, he does get his hand cut off. And I know that sounds brutal as it is. He uses a piano or wire to cut it off, and that was Dopo's first defeat by him. But we do come under the revelation that Dopo was able to preserve that arm and then bring it to a local doctor. And I believe this doctor is just someone who's in lines with the Shishinkai, and he's able to stitch the hand back on a microscopic level, meaning that he's able to stitch the wounds, the nerves, the bones, and everything like that, glue them back together. And it doesn't really take that long for it to heal back. I think it's about a week or so, as the explanation goes. Now, I know that sounds a little bit unrealistic, and it is, in the sense that when we do see Dopo a little bit later on, he faces off against Dorian, and he has a cast on his hand, and he basically he's beaten Dorian, and Dorian does his hypnotic technique, which basically puts a fighter in a dreamlike state where they're fighting against a foe that they may be facing them off against, and to the person who's hypnotized, basically they're in I would say a imaginary based world where they're winning, or they're fighting against the opponent where it's a weaker version of themselves in order to beat them. Now, it's a little bit different for Dopo because he's imagining, or his fantasy-based fight is actually an actualization of how Dorian would respectfully fight back. And it's during that time, Red Kyle tries to break his, I would say, break the hypnotism, and it doesn't really make a difference for him because he's actually fighting against I would say the replica of the imaginary version is the exact same as the Dorian that he's fighting against. But then, you know, throughout that fight, his arm is relieved or revealed, and he is able to fight him with maximum strength, and he just like totally just destroys Dorian, to be honest. And it just goes to show you the prowesses of karate, so, or in this case, the Shishinkai karate. And overall, I would just say, like, you know, the episodes were really good in season 1. Now, season 1 only goes to 13 episodes, so it's, you know, I'm a little bit all over the place because there's a lot of things that I don't want to spoil. But at the same time, going back to that fight with Orochi and Dorian does beat him. I mean, not Dorian. Dopo does beat him. But he leaves the last blow for Kato, and Kato comes in a wheelchair a little bit later. And the warrior spirit in Kato, or Kato, is basically what really defeated Dorian, in the sense that he was in the wheelchair. He had multiple broken bones and all kinds of things, you name it, but he was still able to unconsciously get up, walk over to Dorian, and show his warrior spirit, until it was at that point where Dorian says, "I accept defeat." And that's when we realized that he was defeated. Now, there is more to this. Dorian is one of those annoying type of villain characters who keep coming back. So we do see him a little bit later on. And at this time, when we do see him, he's in the hospital bed, and he escapes the hospital. and he goes to Dopo's, I would say his house, and he basically waits there. I'm not too sure what he does to his wife, but he does something. I'm not too sure what it is, because it just seems like when Dopo comes home, he's looking for his wife and he can't find her, and then come to find out that he kind of like smacks basically like a grenade in his face, as he did in previous episodes, and then he leaves, right? And then we just see Dopo on the floor with kind of like a second degree burnt face from the explosion in his face, right? And it was at this time that we later see Retsukayo, who approaches Dorian. And when he approaches Dorian, he just goes to explain that, a little bit, they have a little bit of dialogue between both of them, regarding their history as being Kaios and learning Chinese Kempo or Chinese Kung Fu. But basically, Retsukayo is just really here to defeat him, like truly defeat him. So they kind of go through a scenery aspect of just past scenes in their lives, and then basically I would just say that Retsukayo does a punch towards his face that puts him in that infancy stage. What I mean by that is it kind of gives Dorian a mental break, where now he is reverted on a mental scale to someone who is of the age of 4 years old or 3 years old or something like that. So Dorian at this point is no longer the Dorian that we know. He's kind of like an infant. Now Dorian doesn't die or anything of that nature. We do see him later on in the series or in the manga. So, but at the same time, he does stay like that. And of course, then the anime kind of progresses into scenes with we're introduced to the other characters, right? So we know about Yanagi and his abilities as a weapon specialist, but also in the sense of he is regarded as one of the martial artists that's privy in the dark arts and his ability to use poison hands. Now his poison hands isn't really anything where he picks up poison, but he uses oxygen in order to basically use pure oxygen in order to instill, I would say, poison. And it's still unclear how that really, I'm not too sure. I think it's what it really is. If I'm trying to break it down correctly, I think that using the palm technique, he's shoving in oxygen through the palm, pulling out the oxygen throughout pressure that's like really encapsulated into the palm. And then what happens is, since the skin goes through a process of oxidation, it then ages really quickly. And I think that's what causes the poison. I could be totally wrong about that. That's just me trying to make inferences based on a little bit of science and what I know about oxidation versus when oxygen is too present. What happens is the cells will start to age a little bit faster. Just like if we were to think about a banana, when we peel a banana and then it goes through the process of oxidation, and that's why it starts to turn brown, right? I think it's very similar to that, but again, I could be wrong. Yanagi is not defeated in season 1. I'm being very careful on how I phrase things because, again, in the US version of Baki 2018, it only goes up to 13 episodes. Now in the Japanese version, we go all the way up to 26 episodes, which then leads to the conclusion for the fighters. But anyway, I'm gonna wrap up this video right here. Sorry if I was a little bit all over the place, but sometimes the scenes go back and forth and back and forth. But I do hope that this episode, and especially my videos for episode 1 and 2, which were basically synchronicity and the dark arts, kind of like brought light into everything. Now there's a couple of cool scenes in between and storyline aspects in between. So such as the first couple episodes, we see Baki doing his gym test or fitness test, right? And it's just like fun comedical aspects, but at the same time it just lets you know how strong Baki really is. They kind of put him in a Clark Kent type of persona, where he's making mistakes because he's so strong, or he's trying to keep his balance and he's falling because he's like he's carving pavement in the ground because he's putting too much pressure through his foot. So it's pretty cool to see that. Also, a big storyline aspect that will come up in season 2 for sure, that is very important for the manhood of Baki, is him and Kazu. I think I'm pronouncing her name right. Basically, it's Baki's girlfriend, and basically how their love comes to fruition until I'm gonna leave her right there. And there's more to it too as well. So really, season 1 is pretty cool. I didn't really mention Sikorsky that much because he came up a couple times with his fight with Yanagi versus Baki, but they don't really come into fruition until season 2. So look out for season 2 as it comes. I hope you enjoyed this video. Give me a like, a comment, subscribe. I try to do this more in a podcast version. And if anything, I'll do more kind of podcasty versions of videos. I try to do that in a couple of my other videos when it comes to comic books, but I'm going to try to do a little bit more. But anyway, this is Zen Manga. Hope you're having a great day. Take care. Peace.